Good evening, everyone. I'm Barbara Peters, and this is the Poison Pen in Scottsdale, Arizona. And tonight is the virtual book launch of the 25th Jack Reacher. And we're so pleased to have Lee Child, who has written 24 Jack Reacher, and Andrew Child, author with Lee of the 25th. And a question we can explore is how much was Lee a part of the 25th and how much was he not? What we have here, because all the books are currently with Lee, is a little sign of the Sentinel, but our autographed copies signed by them are on their way to us. And over there, we have a copy of the Reacher Guy, which is a biography, which, as I've said to Lee before, I thought was an extremely brave publishing project. I didn't think, Lee, I would have had the nerve to let that happen.
Well, I'm not sure that I expected it to happen. You know, there were so many proposals made about things, and I was happy to go with the flow, but I was surprised that it came to completion and got published. And well done, Heather Martin. You know, it's a great book. I've read it and I like it.
Well, I have too. And for those of you who are Reacher fans, the Reacher Guy is definitely a book that you would like. So I really don't need to introduce Lee, but just a few words about Andrew, whom I'm delighted to say Andrew has been with us for his entire, I think, publishing career. Am I right?
Absolutely, yeah. First came in 2009, and you've been good enough to have me back every year since.
Well, it's partly you and partly your beautiful wife, Tasha, but mostly it's you. So Andrew has been a published author, as he said, since 2009 with Even. More recently, he's authored the Cooper Devereaux series set in Alabama and the Paul McGrath series, which is set in New York City. And in fact, you were here in January, Andrew, were you not, with the second Paul McGrath?
That's right, yeah. That was a great event. I had a lot of fun, and I've really enjoyed that series too. So, you know, it's an interesting position now at the sort of, you know, being involved with the Janitor series and Reacher. So be interesting to see where that path leads us.
So that was a question I was going to ask before I retire here and you and your brother talk. Are you continuing the Paul McGrath books as well as writing Reacher?
Well, I'm doing at least one more. It was going to be written this year, but then when the Reacher thing came up, we decided it would be better to postpone it for 12 months. So that's what happened. So I'm going to write that book next year, and I guess it will probably come out maybe January the following year. So there'll be at least one more. I would love it if it continued beyond that, but you know how these things work. It's not entirely in my hands. So all I can say is if you guys want more Paul McGrath, you know, please buy lots of copies, and then I'll get the opportunity to write them. So it's really in your hands, not mine.
That's an excellent pitch. I really like that. Save me from making it. So I have to say, you two really dealt us out a surprise. I mean, I thought COVID was a surprise, but then discovering that Reacher was in transition was an even bigger surprise. Lee, how long were you thinking about that, or weren't you? Did it just sort of occur?
I was, I guess I thought about it for about 6 months before I talked to Andrew about it. You know, what I did when I started, and you remember this too, because I was at your store for Killing Floor and as many of the subsequent books as I could be. And when I started out, I made myself a promise that was also an implied promise to the reader that I would never, ever phone it in. And I think that all of us readers have identified series in the past that the author gets tired, the author gets bored, it's run its course, but they keep on writing them. And probably the modern generation of writers have escaped that because they're aware of it, and so they try and avoid it. And I definitely wanted to avoid it. That I did not want to be the guy that was turning out substandard books just because it was a matter of routine. So I was always very self-aware about how long could I do this, and it was fine for 20 plus years. And about, I suppose, toward the end of 2018, I started to feel I'm going to run out of gas. That I could maybe do one more, two more, maybe even three more if I'm lucky. But at some point, I'm going to grind to a halt. And the problem was, once I thought that, that thought was in my head. So the question was what to do. And it was definitely there was preparation on my part, because at the end of 2018, whatever that book was, Past Tense, I think it was, I did a world tour, including New Zealand, Australia, Britain, US, and I visited as many of the original bookstores that I'd gone to, because I wanted to have a sort of farewell tour, at least in my head. And then came the question of, what am I going to do about it? And obviously the most straightforward thing to do would have been just to stop the series and say, you know, 24 books, that's it. But over the years, the readers have loved Jack Reacher so much that it has morphed into a kind of really weighty obligation. I do not want to let them down. I do not want to deprive them of what they want. And yet I felt I couldn't do it myself, and so it had to end. And I had this, then I developed this ridiculous daydream that I could ingest some magic potion, which I do a lot, by the way. I ingest a lot of magic potions, and I was trying to find the right one. I wanted a potion that would make me wake up tomorrow 15 years younger, full of energy, full of ideas, full of the old passion, full of those capabilities that a younger person has. But of course, that's the fantasy. Sadly, there are no such magic potions. But then I thought, wait a minute, I'm related to a magic potion. Andrew, who is dramatically younger than me, I mean, he's half a generation younger than me. But other than that, he is me. You know, we are incredibly similar. Even though we never really lived together as brothers, later in life, we discovered that we're very much the same. And as you pointed out in the intro, he's a skilled writer. He's done 9 fabulous thrillers. I knew he could do the work. So I hatched this harebrained scheme. Suppose that Andrew took it over and carried on. And maybe there would be a sort of short transition period where we collaborated, and then as he got into the groove, I would step back, he would step forward. And but how do you even introduce a subject like that? Because as you said, you know, the Paul McGrath series, which is the latest series from Andrew, is so good that I was kind of reluctant to even ask him, because I knew that meant I wouldn't get a Paul McGrath that year. So that it was a double-edged sword, it really was. But we were at the Tattered Cover in Denver for the launch of his latest. And it was January, which was his publication date. And of course, January in Wyoming and Colorado, the weather was horrendous. I drove down to Denver. We did the event. Then Andrew drove back through this awful blizzard, what they call a ground blizzard in Wyoming, which means that the snow is moving at about 60 miles an hour horizontally in front of you. And you literally can't see a thing. And I've driven in those conditions, and I use my GPS map on the readout to tell me where to, you know, okay, slight left curve, slight right curve, because you can't see anything. And so Andrew was driving home in those conditions, and I thought this would be an excellent time to pop the question, because he's 99% concentrating on not killing us both. And so he can't freak out. He won't really take it in, and he won't freak out, but he'll lodge it in his mind and he'll think about it the next day. And so, yeah, driving back, I remember it well, during these horrendous conditions, white knuckle. And I said, look, I think I'm going to retire. How would you like to take over the series? And from there, I'll let him take over the story, because it's really his story from that point on.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the way it worked. And I remember actually the beginning of that drive. I remember, once we got out of the city and couldn't really see where we were going, I remember turning to you and saying, you know what, this is 50-50 whether we make it home or not, it was that awful. So yeah, I mean, I was entirely occupied on the driving. So when you asked, it meant I couldn't freak out too much, because that was really my first reaction, because, Reacher is this phenomenal creation, this incredible global um, entity. And, so my first thought was just amazement that you would even consider entrusting it to me. And then the second thought, my mind immediately moved to more practical things. And I thought, well, can I do it? Am I up to the job? Because, you leave pretty big shoes to fill. But then from there, really the clincher was, you mentioned about your motivation being not letting down the readers. And the thing is, first and foremost, I'm a reader, I'm a Reacher fan. In fact, I'm the world's oldest Reacher fan, because I was the first person ever to read Killing Floor. And every year since then, I know what it's like to look forward to the next Reacher. I know that sense of anticipation. And the corresponding sense of disappointment started to flood in at the prospect of there being no more Reachers. So really, that was the clincher. I thought, well, if I don't say yes, there won't be any more Reachers, and I don't want to be in a world with no more Reachers. So I said, yeah, let's try, let's see what happens. And as you said, then we got into the practicalities, and we thought, well, if we collaborate on 2 or 3, then maybe I do them on my own from there. So it's been an amazing journey since that car journey, getting from the initial concept to sitting here today on the eve of the launch.
So did
Which
you actually collaborate?
Say again?
Sorry, did you actually collaborate? It's still not clear to me how this book got written.
Well, it was very screwed up because of the pandemic. We had, obviously, starting out, we had the idea that we would be sitting sort of nose to nose across the desk, somehow collaborating, whatever that means. But pretty soon the pandemic thing hit, and both of our households were taking it seriously, and we were worried about, would we infect them? Would they infect us? Vice versa. And so we did it mostly by email and text and phone. And the email was the best, actually, because there was nothing except the words. All you had was the text, and that was very focused and very precise. It was very clear to us what we were doing. This was not 2 guys just hanging out having fun. We were producing these words. And so the method worked quite well. In terms of who did what, we got to backtrack a step or 2 there, because what I was looking for, the brief really was to not reboot at all. Reboot is the wrong word, but to some extent refresh the series, re-inject some energy. And in particular, I wanted to escape my limitation, which is the absolute just fish out of water thing in the modern world, with all this modern stuff that we have to deal with. I'm hopeless at that. The world is moving on and leaving me behind. And whereas I do believe that readers prefer it, actually, if the technology in a book is slightly behind the curve, because there's something reassuring about that. And also from the author's point of view, it makes a lot more sense, because if you put in this year's hot software or whatever, next year when the book comes out, it'll be meaningless. So it's always good to be slightly behind the curve. But Reacher was getting really ludicrously behind the curve. So part of it was to bring him at least slightly into the 21st century. And so what I wanted to do was to let the plot be entirely Andrew's, so that it would be something that was from a fresh point of view, a more modern take. And so Andrew was supposed to do the plot, which obviously in a lot of ways defines the book, because the way I write, or the way I wrote, was with 0 plan and 0 outline, which sounds glib and it sounds like one of a bunch of alternatives, but literally, I never had any idea what was going to happen, even in the next line. And that was a kind of a little friction at first. I mean, not that we argued about it, but it was just difficult for anybody to work that way because it's a ridiculous way to work. And so, you know, we sat down and said, okay, how does it start? And I said, I don't know. And so Andrew came up with the opening sequence, which I thought was great because it was actually exactly what I would have done. You know, there's always a choice at the start of a Reacher book. You either start with Reacher or you start with a third party. And the third party is either the bad guys preparing something, or the third party is the victim of the bad guys who we see and we intuit, well, he needs help. Let's hope Reacher shows up in chapter 2. And so he started with the victim. And I thought, at that point, I knew this would work because it was exactly what I would have done if I'd sat there long enough and had the inspiration. So, you know, he did that. And then what happened then was what happened repeatedly. He would say, all right, that's pretty good. What do you think happens next? And I would say, I don't know. Because the way I wrote was just to see what happened. And that was slightly different than Andrew's natural way. I mean, he's not a huge outliner. You know, he's not a Jeffrey Deaver who does an outline that's longer than the actual book is going to be. But he likes to know a little bit more than I do. So some of the times, you know, he would ask and I would say, I have no idea. And I could tell he was a little weirded out by that. But he coped with it really well.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. And that was the biggest adjustment for me because, you know, as we went along, as you say, at the beginning, before the pandemic locked us down, you know, we started, as always, on the 1st of September and were able to get the beginning, you know, we made quite a bit of progress before Christmas. But then afterwards, when we were not really able to travel or to get together physically, and we shifted to that more remote method. On the one hand, what you were saying about only having the words to work with, I think looking back was huge because they have to speak for themselves then. You know, there's no question of me saying, oh, well, I thought if we did it like this, these are the good reasons for it, and this is why it might be good, and, you know, potentially argue on their behalf and convince you to do something that you might not agree with otherwise. When it's only the words, they have to stand on their own. So that worked really well. But then I remember those times saying, you know, well, what happens next? And you know, that was something that did take a while for me to adjust to. I think in the end, it was a good thing for me because with us working remotely, there were at least 2 occasions where I kind of fell into the trap of trying to think too far ahead. And I got carried away. I came up with some, what I thought were a couple of tremendous scenes. And, you know, maybe they were okay. But the thing was, they just did not fit into the book because what it turns out is that you can't force Reacher to go anywhere. Reacher goes where he wants and you have to follow and write the story. And I think that, you know, one thing about Reacher, the Reacher books is that there is a very kind of confident style to the prose. And if you're writing without that plan, you know, you don't have a safety net. You're out there on the high wire with no safety net. So that requires a degree of confidence in what you're doing, and I think perhaps that feeds through into the words that end up on the page. So that was something that I tried to look at as an advantage, something to make my writing better rather than something that was just making me worried.
I think that first of all, I'm going to show you the book because there it is. My name's still in huge letters, and because I'm the older brother. And we really need to start way back in the past because, you know, what I've loved about this process is how close Andrew and I are. And that is kind of odd in as much as, because he's younger than me by a significant amount, I was a hooligan teenager when he was born. And then by the time he was compos mentis and able to, you know, communicate and walk and stuff like that, I'd left home. And so we never did the sibling thing. We were never under the same roof together as siblings. We never had any of those sibling experiences, good or bad. You know, no arguments, no fights. But on the other hand, we didn't have those endless days of playing together and all that kind of thing that some siblings do. And so we really need to, it's a puzzle to me why we ended up so close and so similar. And it was a huge relief to me because initially I was one of three. There are three older brothers. Andrew has three older brothers, and I was the middle of those three. And the other two are unlike me in every possible way, mentally and physically. They're small, dark-haired men, the other brothers, and they're scientists. They can be, I think probably they can read, but they certainly would never list it as an enjoyment or a hobby or an activity for them. So I, as a kid with those two, and especially with our parents, and I'm, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that we were starved or abused or ill-treated in any way at all, but it was a very dour, very repressed, very conventional, very miserable life for me. And I was so unhappy in that family that I assumed I must be a changeling. They got me confused at the hospital. They brought home somebody else's kid because I didn't fit in at all. But then all those years later, as Andrew grew a little older, by the time he was 5 or 6, I could see that he was exactly the same as me. And he was also suffering in the same way that I was. Again, we weren't starved or abused or locked in a cupboard under the stairs or anything, but it was just a miserable life. And I could tell he was suffering as a 6-year-old. And so we formed this very unlikely alliance at that stage. Having said that, he was good for me as well for having my own kid, because I kind of practiced on him. I remember one time when he was very young, when he was like a baby, probably, I don't know, 9 months old or something, my parents had to go to my parent-teacher conference, and they left me babysitting. And Andrew had a cold, and he wouldn't go to sleep. So I thought, what do you do with a baby who has a cold? And so I just thought in terms of mechanics and gravity. So I grabbed him by the ankles and held him upside down for about 10 minutes till all the crap drained out of him. And then I put him back in bed and he went to sleep perfectly. So I did a lot of practicing and parenting in those early years. But then I left home and I saw him anytime I would come back visiting. And we were kind of, even though the disparity of age, especially at that point, was huge, we were a pair, we were an alliance. We kind of looked after each other. And he was phenomenally good at it because they moved. After I left home, they moved, but they made the mistake of telling me the new address so I could still go there. And I remember going there, and Andrew must have been 7 by this point. And I wanted to go to some store in a nearby town, and I knew nothing of that area of the country whatsoever. And so I drove to the store and then got hopelessly lost on the way back. And Andrew said to me, he was 7 years old, and he said, you turn left here, you turn right here, then you go along a bit and turn right again. And he was dead right. And so, and I think was it around the same time we went to see Star Wars? Was that, or was that a little bit later? That was probably a little bit later than that.
Yeah, because it was about 77, wasn't it, when Star Wars came out?
Yeah. So yeah, we did stuff, we got along really well. We did stuff together in that aspect. And then as he grew older, obviously, we became really good friends. So this whole thing to me is wonderful. This is like a person I've known all my life, who, or at least all his life. And now we're working together. I'm loving it.
And it seemed like the most natural thing in the world because, if we think back to when Killing Floor came out, I was fortunate to be the first person in the world to read that. And it was a real big responsibility because at the time, the roles were a little bit reversed because I had a good job in the telecoms industry in England at the time. and Lee was out of work and broke, and this book had to work because that's how he was going to feed his family. So he knew that I was a big thriller reader. We had the same tastes in reading. We had all the same books on our shelves. So he gave me a really, really early copy to read. And I've never been more nervous in my life starting a book, because I thought, what if it's terrible? If it's terrible, first of all, I'm going to have to say to my big brother, this book is rubbish. And secondly, then what does that mean for him in terms of, the predicament he's in? So fortunately, of course, it was a fantastic book. I loved it from the first sentence. And so those problems didn't come up. But what that did do was, as you probably remember, Killing Floor is written in the first person. So you're seeing the action through Reacher's eyes. And the way the story unfolds, he gets arrested in the diner, dragged off in the police car, taken to the police station and interrogated, where he's not particularly cooperative. So it's a long time before you learn his name. And I remember so clearly the feeling of thinking, I don't know his name, but I know him. I know this guy. I understand him, because he was created by my brother, who's such a similar person. He was channeling all of the same things that I knew myself. So that was more than a quarter of a century ago. And since then, thousands of times when we've been hanging out, we'll have been joking around, and we'd see a particular situation unfolding, or read about a scenario in the paper or something. And we'd always joke and say, well, Reacher would never stand for that. Reacher would do this, Reacher would do that. So looking back, it was almost like a kind of, unconscious training course for doing this. So, getting to the stage, I mean, once I overcame the shock of him asking me, it actually feels very natural, because Reacher's almost like an extra brother that's been hanging out with us and going in everywhere with us over all of these years.
Yeah, and I got to say, since Andrew became a writer himself and met Tasha, Andrew's wife, it's Tasha Alexander, historical novelist, and it has been an absolute joy to be in a family of writers, because finally somebody knows what you're going on about. Somebody knows what you're doing, and somebody can share your problems, and because they are weird problems and first world problems. I mean, being a writer is great. There's nothing bad about it, but it does have frictions and so on and so forth, and arcane things that you can be frustrated about. And nobody understands except another writer. And it was really nice to have two of them in the family, so that it felt, whenever we hang out together, which is so annoying about this pandemic, we haven't hung out in the way that we used to do. But it's very reassuring, it's very pleasant. It feels like you're coming home, to hang out with other writers, because they're on the same wavelength entirely. They're in the same channel, and they understand your joys and your frustrations.
Andrew, you've talked about Killing Floor, but I have to say that of all the Reachers, the one that I most often sell people is the one that I think has the most amazing first chapter. It's particularly great, I think, for people trying to figure out how to write a thriller. Do either one of you want to hazard a guess as to which one that is?
Is that Gone Tomorrow with the subway?
No?
No?
Persuader?
Yep,
Persuader?
absolutely. It's Persuader. I'm telling you, all the way through. And when he does the thing with the shoe, I went, oh my God, and I mean, it's just so, I mean, he isn't really going down the road that he appears to be going on, but at the same time, you think, what the hell is Lee doing with this? And then all of a sudden it becomes clear. I think it is just such a great opening chapter.
I like that one too, Barbara, that I was worried about it though, that because as you say, for the first however many 20 pages or so, or even 30 pages, it looks like Reacher is a disgusting bad guy with no conscience or no moral compass at all. And then, as you say, at the end of that first chapter, an oh my God moment, which I was so happy to achieve, because they're incredibly difficult. To do a really genuine oh my God reveal is very hard. And I was so happy to get away with that one.
Well, and the other great part about it is at the end of the first chapter, not the end of the book, which is where most often you actually find that sort of thing. So it's always blown me away. Andrew, I used to live, believe it or not, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a part of my past that I try not to dwell on because you both know me well enough to know I didn't fit terribly well into the Southern Bible Belt, especially in the 1970s. But I really love the fact that you have set, or at least a lot of the story in the Sentinel turns around what you call it Pleasantville, Tennessee, right? But
Yeah,
is oh,
it's a sort of semi-fictionalized town which is kind of near Pleasantville, so relatively near to Oak Ridge, you know, because Oak Ridge is, I guess, basically Knoxville, which is so they've got Nashville in between, but Oak Ridge is pretty close, and it's key to some of the some of the action.
well, it is, but it also is a place that harbors scientists and secrets. And when I went there in the 1960s, it was only 20 years after the war. So, you know, all that stuff was still there. The pillboxes at the entrance to the city, you know, where they would gun you down if you didn't pass, and all the rest of it. So I think it's an interesting, it's always been a place out of place. I mean, you know, it's like Los Alamos. There's no real reason for Los Alamos to be in New Mexico other than the war and the bomb project. And the same is true of Oak Ridge, which is, you know, but now all these years later, it's completely different because it's grown into a much different kind of a complex from 1965 to now. And Knoxville's kind of crept out. So it's almost like a megalopolis there, a little tiny one. So I was fascinated to see it in your eyes now compared to the way I remember it. What drew you to set the story there, or at least have it an integral part?
Well, actually, funny that you should mention Los Alamos, because really that was kind of the key. You know, often these things they come at the end of a chain of decisions or of interconnected facts. And one of the things when it comes to research, you know, I always think there are two kinds of research in these kind of books. The kind of specific research you do if you need to discover, you know, how many, you know, how fast the particular car can go, or where is the safety catch on a particular gun. You know, you can find that stuff out. It's easy to do. But the other kind of research, which really is much broader, I think you've got to, I don't think you can do it deliberately. You have to just be interested in stuff, and you have to absorb a lot of things, and then they kind of ferment at the back of your mind and then pop out again when you're looking for aspects of a plot or something like that. So I remember years ago reading this story about some Soviet spies who were active in Los Alamos, and the FBI thought that there were two of them, and they almost caught them. They escaped and went back to the Soviet Union and lived the rest of their lives there and died. But then years later, just by pure chance, through property records, it turned out that actually there was a third spy. Um, they were all related, and there was a third member of the family that no one had known about. And so when we started working on the plot for the Sentinel, you know, we had all the stuff about ransomware locking down all of this particular town's data. So then the trouble is, you're thinking, well, so what? You know, who cares if a town's data is locked down? Why is that important? So you start thinking about what the people behind the attack might be trying to do. And one of the things, you know, there are different people in there with different motives. Some want the town's data released again, some don't, for different reasons. And one reason that we figured someone might want the data to stay locked down is because there's some kind of incriminating secret hidden away in some dark, dingy file somewhere. And so I figured, okay, well, that did actually happen regarding Los Alamos. But as you mentioned, Barbara, you know, that isn't quite so relevant these days because it was so specific to the Manhattan Project and the development of atomic weapons. Whereas Oak Ridge, which also played a huge part in the development of those weapons, actually has evolved over the years and is still super significant in terms of the development of supercomputers and the development of things like protecting computer networks against attacks by other countries. So it just seemed logical to me that since I had in the back of my mind this thing that had really happened in Los Alamos, not really relevant there anymore. So Oak Ridge was the next natural place that you might look to a foreign a foreign power might look to infiltrate if they had bad motives.
It's so much fun you said that, because if you actually go to both places, as I have, the architecture is twinned. So because it was the war and they threw up the same thing, and it's I mean, by now those are historical centers and other construction has intervened, but they're so dramatically different in their landscapes and their cultures. And then you go there and you see the same housing plan, C and D, and you think, oh my God, how did this really happen? So it must have been
Yeah,
a lot of fun for you to do.
it really is. And it's very sort of disconcerting, isn't it? Because most towns, you feel a sense of them having kind of grown organically from some, almost random beginning through, years and decades or even centuries of development. Whereas these places, it's as if they've been transplanted or dropped in from space. It really is weird when you see buildings like that. I've not been to both of them, so I'd love to do that to get the comparison, but certainly Oak Ridge, it does make you feel a little disconcerted.
So Lee, did you have any decision in where the book took place? I'm still groping with exactly since you do this all without a plan. Although I've always thought you did have a plan. I mean, we've talked about this before. I've always thought you were basically writing Shane, and that's a definite story structure. It applies to Reacher quite well.
Well, something else that I've been doing very recently is, Mystery Writers of America, MWA. Every once in a while, like every decade or 15 years or something, they do a Mystery Writer's Handbook full of essays and guidance on how to write these kind of books. And this time around, I'm the editor for the handbook. And so I had to fill in a gap, which was we needed an essay about not outlining, because there were plenty of essays about how to make the perfect outline, how to make the perfect plan, but we needed one that said no plan and no outline. So I wrote that essay. And so it made me think about it in a way that was more serious than the normal sort of glib book event explanation. And I came to the conclusion that actually it is impossible to write without an outline or a plan. You've got one deeply baked in, because all of us who eventually enter this field as writers have first been readers for, probably the first half of your life. You've been a reader. You've read tens of thousands of books in your chosen genre. So when you say that you're writing without an outline, actually you're not. You are trusting the fact that your brain has been programmed with all these various channels and options and examples that you've read before. And so what you're really doing, and it's not plagiarism, it is not copying, because there are very few stories in the world. There are very few plots. I remember I learned that at the age of about 11 when I started at grammar school. In school, we were reading Ovid's Life of Theseus in Latin. And on the bus home, I was reading Dr. No by Ian Fleming. And they are exactly the same story. I mean, literally the same story. Every single beat is identical. A young man of rank is, there's an uneasy standoff between two superpowers, Athens and Crete. A young man of rank, Theseus, who's a prince, James Bond, who's a commander in the Royal Navy, volunteers for this secret mission. He enlists the help of a woman from the other side. He uses a technological device to safeguard himself. In Theseus, it's a ball of string to find his way out of the labyrinth. In James Bond, it's all the various gadgets that Q gives him. He fights a grotesque sidekick in an underground lair. He callously abandons the local woman. He sails home and to a reception that is partly grateful and partly scandalized. It's exactly the same story. There are very few new stories. So if you've read enough, subconsciously your brain nudges you this way and that way until you are in fact following an outline. It's just that you don't know it. So I suppose that's the answer to the outlining question. You can either have an overt one that you've written down on a piece of paper, or you have the one that you've got baked in from 40 years of reading.
Right. Well, when I say Shane, you know, it's a classic American Western, but basically it's a quest novel. I mean, it's basically the Odyssey, or, you know,
Exactly. Yeah.
it's, I remember years ago, Patrick, I have to say, primed me for it. I didn't come up with it on my own, talking to James Lee Burke. And we got off onto, you know, Mallory and the Morte d'Arthur and the whole Arthurian quest. And I think that that's why Reacher, Andrew, do you feel that way, that Reacher, because he is always on a quest, that's one reason his popularity and is so terrific, and why people really want him, because, you know, he's a figure that we all need?
Well, before I answer that, I've got a question for Lee of my own, which is that if you had this guide to writing without an outline, why didn't you tell me?
Well, because I figured the same would happen to you, and it did. You know, it does. That's what happens.
But so yeah, to be serious though, I think that's absolutely the enduring appeal of Reacher. You know, he is essentially an archetype. He's the knight errant who can be traced, you know, all the way back to Greek literature. And the thing is that I think that not only has has that kind of archetype always been popular. You know, you're at a low ebb in your life. There are things in your life that you feel powerless to address. There are things going on that you just feel hopeless about. You know, the knight errant who arrives out of nowhere, puts everything right, and then leaves. It's just enormously appealing. And the way the world is at the moment, you know, everything seems to. I remember I saw a brilliant tweet the other day that somebody just tweeted. All she said was, "I was told there would be a handbasket." You know, and I just think that's brilliant. You know, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And you know, somebody who can, even if it's only on the pages of a book, somebody that can come in and put things right. And not only that, if you think of it in today's context, somebody that can do the specific things that we all want to do. You know, you've got a boss who you hate, but you can't punch him because you'll go to jail. You know, there's a pretty girl on the train, but you can't chat her up because she'll probably say no. You know, so there are so many things that we want to do that we can't. So you know, Reacher is like a kind of emotional proxy for us in many ways, because, you know, we can inhabit his world where things turn out the way that they ought to turn out, rather than being stuck in our world where things go horribly wrong. But I also think that you know, if you think about, you know, these theories about archetypal characters and so on, and the number of stories, you know, that people argue about exactly how many stories there are when they boil it down. You know, some people say 7, some people say 11, but, you know, there really are very few. And you know, even say, remember that that movie Gravity that was based on Tess Gerritsen's book, I think. You know, that was in space, and there were space shuttles, and there were satellites crashing into them, and, you know, all kinds of terrible high-tech things were going on. But ultimately, that was one of those 7 stories. That was somebody is trapped outside of their village and they're trying to get home. And so, you know, the Sentinel, in a way, if you take out the technology and the politics, it's something is lost, and 2 different groups of people are trying to get it. You know, there are only so many stories, so the you know, the challenge is telling those stories in a way that is gripping and appealing, and that, you know, when you start on page 1, something drives you to keep going until you get to the end. So, you know, that's one of the challenges involved in, I think, not only any book, but particularly a series, where readers will come to the books with a certain number of expectations that you have to fulfill.
I think there are only 2 stories really that, and they date back to our primeval time living in caves. And the 2 stories are, you're in the cave and you hear a frightening sound outside. And how do you feel about that? You know, that is basically a lot of serial killer stories. Or one of the most powerful lines in all of storytelling, there's something out there. That is the cave story. And then the other story is if you leave the cave and to go and see what's on the other side of the hill. And that's very much the Reacher story. And you find what's on the other side of the hill, you deal with it. But with the Reacher and all of those archetypes, the leaving is really the most important thing. As far as I know, as far as I can recollect, there's really only one old legend where the guy doesn't leave, and that's the Pied Piper of Hamelin. He's forced to stick around afterward because he doesn't get paid, and he ends up killing all the children. So it's always better if they leave. And there is something reassuring, again, to the reader. As Andrew says, Reacher is a proxy for them. This is what they would like to do. But simultaneously, it's a proxy for wishing that somebody like that would show up. It's both things. And so if somebody like that shows up, sees you at your lowest ebb, at your most hysterical panic, your greatest fear, and fixes the problem for you, he has to leave. Because afterward, what happens if he stays? You know, there's the gratitude issues, the embarrassment afterwards when you realize what you were like at the time. He has to leave to complete the loop. And so those characters like Reacher are in perpetual motion. And, you know, we do it literally. Reacher is never in the same place twice. He's always on the bus going to somewhere else. Next year, he'll be somewhere, I guarantee it won't be Tennessee. It'll be somewhere completely different because he's always on the move, because he has to be.
Yes, the Greyhound's an important part of the Reacher story, no question. Patrick has a bunch of questions over here, so is it okay if he steps forward and asks them? All right.
Absolutely.
Patrick.
Okay. First question is, do you anticipate that Reacher will meet up with his old MP crew in some new stories?
You know, that's a hard question, because instinctively I feel like, again, harking back to what we said, the character perpetually in motion. He can't necessarily have memories. He can't necessarily have accoutrements or things with him. And he certainly can't be part of a soap opera, which basically needs to be static. So will he meet up with characters that have appeared in previous books? He probably ought not, but it is so irresistible to do that. I remember doing it must have been Bad Luck and Trouble, I think it was called. And I was on tour in 2005. And I remember the date. It was June the 21st. I was in a bookstore near Chicago. And it was nagging at me, what is June the 21st? And actually, it's Andrew's eldest daughter's birthday. So I thought, well, it's my niece's birthday, yeah, but there's something else. What is it? And I suddenly remembered it's 10 years to the day since I got fired. And that then produced this flood of memories. What happened to those old guys? What happened to those people that I knew? What would it be like to get together with them? And so I turned that into that book, Bad Luck and Trouble, where Richard does get back together with his old unit. And it was a fabulous story, fascinating to do, but it's got to be rare, I think. It's got to be once every, 10 or 15 books. Otherwise, it does become a soap opera, and it takes away the knight errant. There's two parts, knight and errant. You've got to be errant. You can't be hanging around with people that you used to know.
Actually, a question of my own, which is the Richard Stark books. Although that character in those books is an anti-hero, did they have any influence on you, Lee, when you were writing or conceiving of these books?
It's very hard to say. I mean, subliminally, lots of things could have happened. I mean, I absolutely loved those books. And one of the greatest opening lines of any book was one of them. It said, when the phone rang, Parker was in the garage strangling a man. A first line like that, you've got to read on. So I think in the propulsion, in the leanness of the storytelling, absolutely an influence. I'm not sure substantively an influence.
And I also heard you say something really interesting about, just the style of the books and the prose and what you can do with simple declarative sentences. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, and this is where what Andrew hasn't said is that for his own 9 novels, he was trying very hard not to sound like me, because he would think, people would think, oh, he's just copying his brother. But by nature, we do sound the same and we write the same. So he spent a long time trying not to sound like me. Now he has to. And those simple declarative sentences, absolutely. I mean, I'm a huge fan of simple language that is straight to the point. And, you know, you can get into all kinds of theoretical discussions about show, not tell. I'm a little bit impatient with that too. I don't mind telling people things. You tell, storyteller, you know, there's a clue in the word. And if you've got kids, how many times have your kids ever said to you, Dad, would you show me a story? They never say that. They say, will you tell me a story? There's nothing wrong with simple declarative sentences. And one of the things that I like most about the Sentinel is that Andrew was seamless with that. You know, here's a guarantee that if you went through this book line by line, it would be extremely difficult to know which are my lines and which are his lines.
All right, I have a gentleman named Tuno who asks, has Reacher ever faced a Mexican drug cartel? He says El Paso, Texas would make a great setting.
I think that, yeah, was it 61 Hours? He meets, there's a drug lord called Plato. Is it Plato? Yeah, I think so. And,
yeah, it's Plato.
Yeah, very short little guy. And I can't remember whether he's specifically Mexican or not, but yeah, he was certainly of that type. And I'd like doing that book simply because one understands that those cartels down there are so vicious that you could have real vicious backstory behind this guy and it was plausible. So yeah, you know, no problem with that. Reacher is an equal opportunity vigilante. It doesn't matter who you are. If you're a woman, he'll kill you. If you're a Mexican, he'll kill you. If you're a bad person, he'll kill you. If you're a good person, if you're a good Mexican drug dealer, he'll help you.
Okay, Donna has a good comment here. Or question. She asks, when Lee stops co-writing the books, will he continue to read them? Or will it be impossible to switch off commenting on new plot lines, etc.?
That's a great question.
I will totally always read them. Absolutely, of course I will. I'll totally read them. And it's impossible to switch that off. You know, that happens when I'm reading anybody. Anybody that's sufficiently close to me that I could conceivably be doing what they're doing. For me to really enjoy a book, it's got to be something I couldn't do myself, because then I'm just completely abandoned to it. If it's something that I conceivably might be able to do myself, then I do have that. It's like a DVD commentary track. I'm enjoying the book, absolutely, but I'm saying to myself, okay, I see what you're doing there, but you do understand this means you got to do that 3 pages from now. You know, that's always running through my head. And what I love is if they, I remember one Robert Crace book, I can't remember the title, but he ended up in temporary charge of a very small baby. And there was going to be a raid on this place where he was. So he put the baby in a desk drawer, which I would have done too. But then he shut the drawer. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Because I wouldn't have thought of shutting the drawer. And so, yeah, reading stuff that's close to my own is always has that commentary track running. So I will, of course, always read Andrew's Reacher books. What I really want to also read is Andrew's Paul McGrath books. And so he is going to have to do something that I've never done, which is write 2 books a year.
Right, you're the architect of your own misfortune. Truly. All right.
Let's see here. Okay, Greg asks, this is for Lee, did you and Andrew secretly begin your triumvirate with Reacher in Blue Moon?
Did we secretly? No, we did not. But Blue Moon was the ultimate clue that I had to do this, because you know, I defend Blue Moon, and I think Blue Moon was a fine book in and of itself. But in terms of the process that I described of, constant, well, what now, what now, what now? I felt that the choices in Blue Moon were a little bit repetitive and monolithic, in as much as every time I came to what now, I would just say to myself, oh, kill them all. And I felt that that was a sign that maybe I was running out of invention.
Someone mentions that you do a mean Michael Caine impression.
I do a what?
He says, are you ready to compete with Steve Coogan and Rob Brydon with your Michael Caine impression?
I don't know what that is about. Who is Michael Caine? I mean, this is confusing to me, I'm afraid.
Michael Caine?
Oh, Michael Caine. Okay, yeah. Michael Caine. Yeah, that came about by a habit I have, and maybe Andrew does the same, which is that to know whether it is really working, you read it to yourself. And I don't necessarily mean out loud, but that kind of semi out loud where you're hearing it in your head. And especially with dialogue, if it is working well, you can read it in any accent at all. So I check that. I do a Tony Curtis accent, I do a Michael Caine accent, which are radically different. The Tony Curtis sort of Brooklynese and the Michael Caine Cockney accent are radically different. Just not the same at all, but basically not the same language. But if the dialogue is right, it will sound right in any accent.
All right.
Anything else?
There are a couple random ones like, will Reacher ever come to Australia?
Well, I'll let Andrew answer that, because like I say, it's up to him because all I'm going to say is I don't know. So Andrew has to decide that sort of thing.
Well, I don't know either. I'm certainly not ruling it out, but part of the problem is I've never been to Australia myself. So, maybe if I get the chance to visit, if we ever are allowed to travel anywhere again, if I go to Australia and I see something there that I think would work with a Reacher story, then who knows? But so it's not ruled in and it's not ruled out. So watch this space.
I mean, Reacher would work in Australia. It was an option, that the frontier feel, the emptiness, because I've been to Australia a few times and, I've got a lot of good friends there. And actually, Barbara and I were just talking before we started this broadcast about the great crime writing coming out of Australia right now, especially from Australian women. They're just wonderful right now because that stuff works there. And I remember talking to somebody who she said she lived in a very isolated rural area. And I said, how far away is your nearest neighbor? And she said, 20 minutes. And so I thought, well, 20 minutes, yeah, that's about a mile walking. So I said, what is that, about a mile? And she said, no, 20 minutes driving. So, Australia would work for Reacher. The problem is it's very small population. So if you sell to Australia only, you can't make much money.
Well, there's some cities in Australia that I guess you could at least visit, but of course you'd have to abandon a bus for an airplane or a boat, so it'd be different. Andrew, I have a question for you since I've been lucky enough to come and visit you. You have one of the most amazing pieces of furniture in your office I have personally ever seen. Your incredible desk. Are you still writing at your incredible metal desk?
Yes, I certainly am. I love that desk. That was one of the things I was most happy about when we moved because, back in Chicago, we had a sort of inner city apartment where there wasn't room. That desk would physically not fit in the room I used to work in. So when we moved here and we had more room, that was one of the first things I did was order that desk. And I just love it. That's the only place I will work now. So I'm delighted to have it.
It's almost like flying a jet to sit at your desk, the vast expanse and so forth. It's terrific. So
exactly, it's made of aluminium and it's supposed to look like the wing of an old-fashioned plane. So it's very fun. I like it a lot.
So right there, you just brought up my last question, which is both of you are British, and you just said aluminium, which of course I would never say. So do you have to go through and think about any possible Brit speak that might creep into the books when you're writing them?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say that I do, and I mean, it's changed over the years because the first books I wrote, I had an English hero, but operating in America, because when I started them, I still lived in the UK, and I didn't feel confident enough to pull off a fully American sound. But you know, over the years, you know, I've lived in the States for a long time now, and my wife is American, and you know, when you look back, as kids, most of the popular culture you consume in the UK is from the States, TV shows, movies, everything like that. So, you know, in a way, I'd like to think of myself as being kind of almost bilingual, you know, in UK English and US English. It's a bit like when you buy a new computer, you know, you have to set up the keyboard and it'll say, what language do you want? You know, English UK, English US. And I kind of mentally switch between the two. But, you know, and I will consciously try to avoid things that I sound too British, and then I'll also get Tasha to read it for me before it goes to the editors, so she can tell me if there's anything in there that sounds you know, a wrong note. So it's something certainly to be conscious of, and something that I pay a lot of attention to trying to get right.
I did the same thing with my wife, who is also American from New York. And in the early days, she would do that. She would do the checking, and we used to call it the House Committee on Un-American Activities. She would spot these words. But the huge problem is, there are two huge problems. Number one, for instance, she was, you know, she's an East Coast intellectual, and therefore is inherently fluent in every version of English. So she could never really be sure, was she right or wrong? And the other factor is that somewhere in America, everything is said and used. And so you can never be entirely right, and you can never be entirely wrong. I mean, I'm coming across all the time regional phrases that are, for instance, the phrase out of pocket, certainly to a Brit and to almost all Americans. Out of pocket means that you have laid out some money on behalf of somebody else and you have not yet been refunded. So you're out of pocket. But in you know, small part of Alabama and Arkansas, out of pocket means unavailable. Because I heard that from a guy from Arkansas who said, you know, I said, can you make coffee on the 10th or something? And he said, no, I'm out of pocket. And I thought, what does that mean? He can't pay for the coffee because he's got no cash, or what? But everywhere in America, something is said that other people think is wrong. And so it is virtually impossible to be completely right or completely wrong. All you've got to try and be is plausible to as many people as you can.
That's an excellent answer. Gentlemen, do you have any final question you'd like to ask each other before we sign off?
I haven't got a question, but I just want to make sure that Andrew understands how grateful I am that he's doing this, because, you know, it was a big deal to put aside his own stuff to help me out. And, you know, it's a thrill. It's like a dream come true for me. So I really want people to understand how happy I am that he said yes on that horrendous blizzard night. And I wonder, actually, suppose the weather had been good, would it have been a different answer?
I know that's a great hypothetical, isn't it? Because I'm sure it wouldn't have been, because as you know, I really hope I will get the opportunity to do more Paul McGrath novels, because I love doing them. But ultimately, as I said before, the idea that there might not be any more reaches, you know, that was just too much to live with. So that was the thing that tipped the scales, and I think it always would have done, regardless of the weather. But it would be interesting to go back and have a kind of, remember that movie Sliding Doors, where you had two different versions of events going in parallel. It would have been fun. Yeah, we could have had a summer day and a winter day, and see how it was different.
Yeah.
See if you got different answers. So when is it you're thinking that Reacher 26 will come out? Will you stay on this same schedule?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it'll be a year from tomorrow. No pressure, Andrew.
I love it. Thank
Hey,
you
it's-
both very, very much for a really wonderful conversation. You answered lots of questions I'm sure your fans would have. And for those of you who might like to see some childhood pictures of Andrew with his older brother Lee, I will go back and remind you that the Reacher guy over there has some serious photographs. And one of the really great ones is Lee, who is about 9 feet taller than Andrew because he was just little. But anyway, it will give you a real feeling for the two of them. And, you know, it is wonderful that you grew up to a point where you could become the brothers that was difficult to do. The age difference in childhood is vast, but the age difference in adulthood is much less. So
Yeah.
how wonderful.
It is.
Good night, guys. And thank you, all of you who joined us for this evening. We really have enjoyed our time with you.